Good morning. Well, thank you. Welcome to Learn to Speak Designer. My name is Rich Fulcher. I am the design manager on the material design systems team.
And I'm Rob Jampeacher. I'm a visual designer on the material design team.
Thanks for coming this morning. When you talk to designers, it may often feel like they're speaking a completely different language. And even when you can kind of follow along in context and get some of the meaning, the precise kind of vocabulary that they use may elude you. So we're here today to help kind of translate some of the things designers say. And to do that, we're going to give you a little bit of a view of the design process and how several different forms of designers kind of approach their work. So the language of design is wide-ranging. You know, there are terms that literally go back centuries in their usage. And there are newer formulations from this modern digital age, and there are things that are just outright slang. Both Rob and I are part of the material UX team. So much of our work involves building and evolving the material design system that was first revealed at I/O, well, not here, but up there 2 years ago. But more broadly, our mission is to empower designers and developers to do their best work. And that's why we have tools like the material design guidelines themselves, the other tools like the icon library, and even discussions like the one we're having today, all try to pursue that goal.
So it's natural to ask, why is learning design terms important? And there's a lot more collaboration happening between designers, engineers, developers in team-based environments, so it's important to have a shared vocabulary there. And there's also more individual engineers that are wearing design hats, and so being able to think like a designer is really useful in order to toggle between those roles. And yet, designers and developers often come from different backgrounds. They have different education, they have different training, they have different jobs and even workflows. Our goals with this talk is to just have simpler, better understanding between designers and developers and improve collaboration. So to start, we want to sort of dive into the design process. And that means by learning about this process, we can have a little bit more context for what's to come. And a little bit later in the talk, we'll look at some more technological terms and advanced concepts and principles. So much of the design process is a little bit invisible when you see the final output. When you see this brand launched, this is an example from our own practice, the logo for GV or Google Ventures. You don't have a lot of context about what went into making this. Few people see all the different variations, iteration after iteration, and there are lots of sort of dead ends and false starts, and files that are saved over and over. You may know final and final. The design process often expands to the time that you have and the resources that are available. So it's scaled and it's never really done. So that's what the design process looks like from an asset point of view for the logo. But let's take another look at sort of how it looks if we visualize it. If we visualize the process, the final grooming of the logo might start to get linear and really drive towards a conclusion. But if we go back in time, we might see some more twists and turns and waves along the way. And ultimately, we kind of realize that, well, design is really not a linear process. You might even think we have no idea what we're doing.
Fortunately, designers do have a term for this hairball of confusion that's happening over here, and that's ideation. You might think of this as really similar to brainstorming. You're trying to generate as many ideas as possible, and the emphasis is quantity, not quality. But I think what happens is people hear brainstorm, and they think of something that's a lot more contained. They think, okay, we're going to go in a room for a half hour, and we're going to brainstorm, and we're going to be done. But for designers, this process happens over a much longer time scale. You're not just kind of putting a thought onto a sticky note and being done. You're taking that idea and you're starting to express it. You're starting to sketch it, maybe do one sketch or multiple sketches. You might do a study. And you're just trying to explore the idea in a little bit more detail, see if there's something useful there, make sure that there isn't something, and generate new ideas, kick you off into new directions, and kind of keep exploring. And as these ideas develop, they're going to take different forms. Like early on, they might be diagrams trying to capture how the different parts of the system relate to each other, or how different roles within the system might collaborate to achieve a bigger goal. And they might eventually take the form of wireframes, starting to explore what individual screens might look like. And note the sketchiness of wireframes at this level it's a feature, not a bug. You're trying to focus on just the most important elements. It's okay to be kind of hand-wavy about the secondary things on the screen. And this is why designers sometimes gravitate toward tools like whiteboarding or using big chunky markers to draw. By selecting a tool like that gives them limited fidelity, they're actually kind of keeping that level of unspecificity which is desired at this point of the process. Now, eventually, you do get into kind of higher and higher fidelity versions of this, especially as you gain kind of confidence in the idea and you want to kind of really make sure it's working and really kind of connect everything together. Now, this isn't strictly linear, even though we kind of did the line at the end. There's plenty of room for revisiting what's gone before, of going back and ideating one more time. And as a developer, you may not see all of this work. You may just see some of the tangible outputs of this, things that we call artifacts. I should define that one. Artifacts are just design documents. It's a fancy way of saying it. It's maybe a little philosophical, but it's important to note that these aren't the design itself. These are kind of the things that are created as a byproduct of the design process. This is how designers try to kind of capture the thinking that they're doing and putting it into a tangible, shareable form. And no one artifact kind of captures everything. They're kind of together, you can put a lot of different artifacts together and hopefully get to a more and more complete embodiment or specification of the design. So just as there are many styles of artifacts, there are many styles of designer. We're going to look at a few today. We're going to focus on interaction design, visual design, and motion design. I'll start with interaction design. That happens to be my specialization. I still think back to my first day of my first class about years ago when I started learning about design. And back then, it wasn't even called UX. It was called Human-Computer Interaction, HCI. But fortunately, I'm not quite old enough that it was called man-machine interaction, which is what happened before. In that first class, the kind of core definition of design boiled down to just 5 words. Users, context, tools, tasks, and goals. What we do in experience design is that we study users who have a certain context. We create tools for them to perform tasks in order to achieve higher level goals. Users, context, tools, tasks, goals. And speaking of things you learn on your first day, there is this artifact that every new employee at Google gets to read on their first day, and it's called the 10 Things We Believe to Be True. And this is kind of Google's way of trying to capture some of the culture of what makes something googly. And number 1 on that list is focus on the users, and all else will follow. Now, when we focus on the users, we work closely as designers with user experience researchers or user researchers. They help us to understand the users. Who are they? What are they like? Their context, and that's kind of broadly their technical, physical, interpersonal environment that might inform the way that they act. And of course, their goals. Why are they doing the things that they're doing here? What is the kind of bigger purpose they're trying to achieve? Now, our research colleagues have just as big a vocabulary, and we can't possibly do service to all of that in this talk today. But if you really want it, clamor for a sequel in your space or in the YouTube comments. So coming back to design, interaction design focuses on the tools and the tasks. We're building the tools to help accomplish the tasks. So as an example, I'm going to take one of our newest tools to kind of walk through how the design process worked. There's another kind of Google statement, our mission statement, that I think most people are quite familiar with, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And I think a lot of times when people read this, they focus on those first 5 words. Oh, organize all the world's information and kind of stop there. But making things universally accessible, taking it and kind of bringing it to all of the users, is it's a very important responsibility for the designers in particular. So to that end, we've recently introduced a tool for Android called Accessibility Scanner. You may have already used this. the goal of this tool, or the types of things we wanted to support, were we wanted to make it easier for a team to evaluate how their app was performing with regard to accessibility. It could flag some common issues, a touch target that's too small, a case where text contrast relative to its background was too low and would be hard to read, or images that would be lacking content descriptions for people that are relying on screen reading technologies. The goals of the project when the designers started work on this were they wanted to do something that would fit smoothly into the user's workflow. You want to kind of make it easy for someone to use this tool so that it doesn't feel like a burden to their existing process. You wanted to kind of reinforce the types of guidance we already give in the material design guidelines. And we want to educate users about why these issues are actually important. So where does a designer get started on an app like this? Well, in this case, she started with the users. Who is this product for? And user is a shorthand. It's not a single user. There's not like some perfect hermetically sealed individual we go to and we can test. User is many, many different types of users with many different characteristics. So this designer, she goes and she talks to some of those users. She talks to developers, designers, QA testers, product managers, because they may all have roles to play in ensuring that these apps get to better and better levels of accessibility. Now, one way that she can capture that information is through something called a user needs statement. This is just a way of capturing the who, the what, and the why about a user's relationship with this kind of proposed design. So the who is, it's actually a name in these cases. That's surprisingly handy to refer back to people later. Kind of the role they serve. The what is, what do they need to do? What is their need in this situation? And the why is, why are they doing that thing? What are they valuing? Why is this important for them? When you have these insights, you can use them in a lot of ways as a designer. Some of it's subconscious, where you're just kind of aware of this work that you've done and it informs what happens going forward. But you can also turn it into kind of tangible things. You can turn it into design principles. It can help you prioritize the features as you kind of discuss with the larger team what this product is going to be. So once we have a sense of the user, we can start to structure the experience. The interface designer sketches out how the different functions relate to each other. And again, this isn't just one sketch. This is many. We're ideating through this. And you are trying to understand how all of these different users, all of these different tasks can interrelate. So the name for kind of this phase is traditionally information architecture, or IA. And this name is no accident. IA has a lot in common with traditional architecture. It is both an art and a science. It is creative and technical. It's focused on thinking about spaces broadly, spaces like this space, how they're structured, what does the user do in each of those spaces, how does the user move between those spaces. And it also takes advantage of established principles, common patterns. So just like software architecture will define the structure of a system, information architecture defines the structure of an experience. So let's come back to Accessibility Scanner. Even as we're refining the IA, there's still more sketching happening. There's more work being done. And you're starting to get to sketches that look more and more like screens. So the designer, she's going past kind of the high-level structure of this and indicating how each room, back to the architecture, will work. She's thinking about many different users here. How does a first-time user enter? What are some of the high-traffic areas that all users are going to go through? For a frequent user, how do they go back and retrieve kind of an older archive report they may have generated a while ago? Now, over time, these sketches become more detailed. When you take one particular designer or one particular user and you sketch out a sequence of steps through the app, in this case, opening the app, activating the checker, going to the app they want to run the checker on, generating a report, reviewing a report. This specific presentation is something we call a storyboard. And this practice isn't unique to UX at all. This is long used as a pre-visualization technique for film and for video production. The idea is you want to kind of get the sense or the feel of the experience without actually having to build it or pay for it and those types of things. So as you get kind of to the next level of detail, you start to focus on all of the kind of individual elements that shape the room. You're moving from architecture to interior design at this point. So the designer has to be very specific about the individual controls that will appear. Which buttons, which icons, what options are in the menu. And collectively, we call all of these different things affordances. You want to be able to readily perceive how something works just by looking at it. And in the physical world, we see plenty of examples of this. You're all sitting conveniently on these affordances called chairs. You walk up to a chair, you look at it, you're like, I don't know what to do with that. My butt goes there. That's a chair. Door handles are the same way. You look at it, okay, it opens, it closes. Buttons on the interface, whether I'm going to click it or whether I'm going to touch it, there should be something about the object that indicates to any user how it's meant to be used. Now, affordance isn't a guarantee. We've all walked up to a door and pushed when we should have pulled. But it should at least be a signal. That idea of kind of perceived interactability of that object is really important. So we're going to shift our emphasis now from interaction to visual. We're going to talk about how the brand identity, how the stylistic distinction can develop and further support that interaction and further guide users. And of course, as I pass the mic or the clicker here, the process is actually a lot more fluid and a lot more kind of interconnected than that. There's lots of parallel thinking, lots of back and forth. And there are, in fact, many designers that are kind of comfortable in both of these camps and can move very fluidly between them. You never really kind of just stop thinking about one and move to the other.
So thanks, Rich. So while Rich specializes in interaction design, my focus on the team is a little bit more on the visual design side. And there are some fundamentals and principles that you can master to better understand this aspect of the design process. Today we're going to cover layout, art direction, and typography. And being more aware of these steps will help you better communicate with designers on your team and maybe even think more like a designer yourself. So with visual design, there's not just one way to approach it. There's many methods, there's many styles, and it really needs to fit closely to the content and the problem at hand. There are now more than 1 million apps, material apps in the Play Store, which is an amazing number. Lots of variation and richness there, and that's because material is designed to be a flexible system. And this richness is created in part by the application of a brand to the interactive elements that Rich described earlier. So we'll touch on some of this today, but there's also an article on Google Design, our design blog, called Expressing Brand and Material that also touches on some of these things. And Google Design in general is a great place to go if you're thinking about going material or if you just want to learn a little bit more about how to think like a designer. So one way that we would design material to be flexible for brands is that we stress test it using fictional brands in different contexts. And these are 3 of our fictional brands. One is called Shrine, and it's a shopping app. Another is called The Fortnightly, and it's a news app. And the third is called Pesto, and it's kind of a cooking and recipe ideas app. So you can see already on their logos how visual design communicates the nature of these apps. And we'll dive a little bit more into Shrine to start and talk a little bit about layout, hierarchy, and art direction. So anytime you've got an array of products, it's helpful to have a system to organize them. And that is where it's useful to meet the grid. Grids might seem basic, but they're actually a foundational principle of design with a rich history that goes way back to some of the most iconic and beautiful works of modern design more than a century ago. Users know grids, they understand grids, and grids allow them greater speed and confidence in browsing, and they allow designers greater speed and confidence in designing. So they're a really important part of material design. You shouldn't dismiss the terms you think you know. Let's dive in and define grid a bit. It's really the tool that helps you solve a visual problem and organize information. And as the definition says, grids communicate order, economy, and consistency. And they provide a common structure and some flexibility to support different templates and organize content. Grid systems include things like margins, shown here in green. And margins are both functional and aesthetic. They enhance the pleasure of reading a page on the screen, but they also provide an area of safety for the content and the elements. So if you have a book and the margins are too small, your thumbs might obscure the text. If you have a screen and the margins are too small, you might be pushing interactive elements out to the edges where users can't easily touch them and use them. Gutters are another part of any grid system. And they're similar to margins, but they denote the space between the columns instead of outside the content area. The gutter, the margins, and the grid help define how images and text will align or lay out on the page. This is where we get the term layout. And in Shrine's case, the layout is clean, it's orderly, and it keeps with the sort of polished look of this brand. The grid is not just implied in this case, it's emphasized with cards. And again, this really helps Shrine feel locked up, put together, kind of buttoned up, clean. It retains that clean look at every resolution, from phone to tablet, regardless of the number of items. So if you have a really well-designed grid, you can actually do this. This grid scales responsively, and in order to do this, we have paid really careful attention to the breakpoints and also the image aspect ratios. Hold on, what's an aspect ratio? Let's define it. An image or graphic has an aspect ratio of 2:1. That means that its width is twice as long as its height. So, this is sort of what we mean by aspect ratio. And we can see how, as the aspect ratios shift in Shrine, some of the images get more or less white space around them. Let's define white space too, because that's another one of those terms that's easy to kind of gloss over. It's deceptively simple. It's not blank space. It's actually an important design element. It helps to balance between the positive and the negative space and really help a user move through or navigate around all those elements with ease. And when the products in Shrine have enough white space, it helps them feel uncluttered, and it really elevates them and makes them feel special and makes people want to take a closer look. And this is because white space is playing the right role within the hierarchy of the layout. So, when I talked earlier about margins and gutters, margins might be bigger than gutters because of the hierarchy between those different spatial elements. Hierarchy is a designer's word for priority level. It includes text, it includes images, it even includes white space. And it basically helps us to say what's important. What should someone see first? What should someone see last? And it ties back to that user experience that you want the user to have all the way in the beginning of the design process. So here are two layouts, and on the right, we've tweaked the hierarchy just a little bit. The headline's a little bit more prominent, a little bit more kind of design forward. The logo's not getting lost. We know which app we're using. Product descriptions are a little bit more present, and everything, the price and everything is a little bit easier to read. So things have gone from feeling sort of bland and even and all the same size to maybe a bit more considered, like this app has a point of view, and more engaging. When we were working on Shrine, we often used the Resizer, and this is a tool that helps us to visualize and test how this app and many apps respond to various breakpoints on desktop and on mobile and on tablet. And it's a great tool. We've shared it with everyone, so you can go ahead and try it yourself on your apps or your websites at design.google.com. Let's shift now from layout into art direction. So now we're talking about the images, the illustrations, or in this case, the photos, and why they come to look that way. So let's look at the images on screen from Shrine. They're shot in a studio, they're silhouetted, you can see the outlines of the shapes, they're not on models, they're not candid snapshots, and the shoes are styled to be a little bit playful, even kind of humorous. Each one of these things reveals a decision that someone made, and that person is called an art director. At Google, we use art direction all the time, even in some places that you wouldn't expect. These are actually photographs, these iconic images from material design as our backgrounds. And there's a great place, there's a great article on design.google.com about how we did these Android wallpapers, written by Rachel Bean, one of our art directors. And she walks you through the process of collaborating with photographer Carl Kleiner to commission these paperscapes and how they came to be. So because art directors are constantly giving feedback to their team and to photographers and other collaborators, you might say that they have their own set of phrases and terminology, and they're a little bit more gestural, make it bigger, zhuzh it up. So these are sort of some of the terms you might hear art directors using on the team. So we talked a little bit about Shrine. Now let's shift our focus to the news app, The Fortnightly, to talk a little bit about typography. So typographers both use type in a layout and make typefaces for use. So there's a really broad skill set even under the term typography. But whenever I look at a typeface, I like to ask myself three simple questions, sort of going back to Rich's basics. What is a typeface's history? How can I describe its forms? and what is it used for? So the history, the forms, and the use. And this really helps you kind of x-ray a typeface and understand it more quickly. So let's start with forms. If you really want to speak fluent designer, you definitely don't want to mix up the difference between serif and sans serif. The sans part is easy. That's just the French word for without. But serifs are the little strokes on the end of the letter, and they help make the letters come together into a word shape that makes them more readable and a little bit easier on the eye. Sometimes typefaces with the same name have slab or serif variations, and so in this case we have Roboto sans and Roboto slab, and the slab is just the type of the serif in this case. It's not tapered, it has blunt rectangular ends, which are called terminals. So serifs are an aspect of typeface's form, but serif typefaces also vary along other aspects that I mentioned earlier, their history and their use. And different faces have different visual impact. So here we've made a grid of 4 faces to kind of have as a comparison, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the lower right-hand corner about Times New Roman. It depends, when you're picking a typeface, it depends on how or where you're going to be using it, if you're going to be using it on print, on the screen, or both. And for the fortnightly, Times New Roman is a great example compared to the other typefaces here. It has a great rich history of newspaper design. It was actually designed for the Times of London in 1923. And therefore its use, it was designed to be used in situations like low contrast newsprint, where the ink and the paper are not as, it's not a bright white paper, so you need a bolder typeface. And also, that means it translates really well to screens that are coarser in their resolution. So its use in print has actually extended its use on the screen. And it has another use too. It needs to get lots of words in. So this means that the ascenders and the descenders are short and the x height is high, so we can really set it very closely together and get lots of words on the page. So I've used a bunch of design terms here. I've talked about ascenders, like the K of quick. I've talked about descenders, like the G of dog, and also about the X height. Let's zoom into a few of these. I mentioned descenders earlier. These are letters that drop below the baseline. Baselines are essential for aligning text and images across columns, pages, or websites. And well-designed baseline grids help give a rhythm and a sense of proportion and order to a design. The other 2 lines you see on this slide are the top line, where the ascenders like B and L hit, and the midline, and that helps to define the X height. The X height is really just the height of the lowercase letter x, and it gives a sense of proportion to the letter forms of a typeface. So if I'm a really short person and I wear a really long shirt, then that's going to make my legs look shorter. You're viewing my entire body in proportion to the elements within it. A typeface is the same. So if it has a very high X height and very short ascenders, that will make the letter forms, the counter forms, the O's of the shapes within the O's seem very big, and that can be very helpful for readability. Leading measures the space from baseline to baseline, so between lines of text, and kerning measures the space between the letters themselves. So, if you have 2 sort of irregular letter forms like a capital W and a lowercase a, you might want to kern them closer together or scoot them closer together. Earlier I noted that Times New Roman was a really good fit for fortnightly, and we see it here in the headlines, and it really gives it that newsy feel. But if we look a little bit more closely, there's actually another typeface being used here too. It's Roboto, and it looks great at all sizes here below the headline. It could just as easily be something like Helvetica or something else. You can use lots of fonts in material design, but using a contemporary sans serif like Roboto gives this kind of historically inflected design a subtle and kind of contemporary twist. So here we're using Roboto in the deck and the body, and these are actually editorial terms that designers sometimes use, and they can refer to multiple things. So they can refer to the size. Usually the body is the smallest of the head, the deck, and the body. They can refer to the hierarchy. The body is usually read last. Or they can refer to function. The deck usually explains the headline. So this is a situation where those vocab terms have multiple meanings. You might notice also that the body copy is in a different language. And it's intentional. Lorem ipsum is placeholder copy or text, and designers use it frequently to kind of see how a layout will look before the final copy is in place. And Lorem ipsum basically says to everyone on the team, don't read me, just look at me. It's the design of the type, the typography here that's important. So as you can see, visual design is a really iterative process. If you think back to that hairball of confusion we talked about at the beginning, you really have to go through a lot of different things and explore them. But there are a lot of traditional terms that we can fall back on and traditions that we can use to help solve those problems. So there were lots of timeless ideas we use in material design, but there are new terms and techniques coming all the time. And to talk about one of them, here's Rich.
Thanks, Rob. I want to close out with talking about motion, kind of the last of the three big pillars of design, and we'll spend the least amount of time on this. There is a great other talk, that was last night, from I/O this year. You should try to catch up on it later. Motion is where interaction design and visual design come together. This is where kind of what you're seeing and how it behaves come together in motion and kind of the animation of the interface. We recently updated the guidelines around motion in the material design spec, and the talk from last night covers some of that. If you stay tuned to our Twitter feed at Google Design, we'll let you know when that YouTube video is available. So there's just two concepts I want to hit quickly when it comes to motion. The first is responsive interaction. How does an affordance respond when it's been triggered or touched or tapped? So in material, we try to encourage the use of motion to kind of tell a little micro story about what's happened, to answer that user question of, well, what happens when I touch this thing? And in this case, the example here, you're tapping on one of two images in this grid, and a few things are happening. You're getting rid of all the other images, but they're not just kind of all disappearing at the same time. They're just kind of washing away, directionally emanating from the point where the user touched. Now, that's a story that happens like in under a second. It's a really short story. But it's also a way of kind of communicating to the user, okay, there is still something important here. These things that are moving away are less important, and maybe it's opening up space to give more details about that thing that you've clicked on. We always want these types of interactions to be thoughtful and never distracting, which leads to the second concept, which is that motion should always feel natural. This is one of the big kind of things we emphasize in the guidelines for material design, is that motion should contribute to the feeling that you're manipulating pieces of paper, that you're kind of physically dragging surfaces. And along those lines, it means that things should accelerate and decelerate and change direction in natural ways. When things don't behave naturally and you have an abrupt stop or an abrupt begin or a sudden change of direction, the user notices it. It's distracting. And we wouldn't be doing a service to motion if we didn't give them at least one vocabulary term. So we'll do the oft-used adjective janky. This is anything that's unnatural. This is motion that stands out and gets its attention, but not in a good way. It's when motion goes bad. As the Supreme Court would say, you'll know it when you see it. Now, motion is where design becomes most essentially code-based. You will see very tight overlap between designers and developers here, and some of those designers are very kind of fluent and comfortable on both sides of that. And it's this collaboration between design and engineering that brings this experience to life. So we've talked process, we've talked interaction, visual, motion, design. Let's pull it all together in a quick example. We're going to do lightning round design review, kind of showing 3 stages of a product. And for this one, we're going to use Pesto, one of the brands that Rob mentioned before. That's the kind of cooking app where the goal is to have this beautiful, richly illustrated cookbook-style experience. All right, Rob, take it.
OK. This is an interesting start. It's pretty good. But, I feel like it's missing color. And the brand feels a little bit weak. I also think the grid is super dense. I mean, this is a lot of recipes, more than I could ever cook in a week. And, the pencil's really important there. Let's bring that into more of a primary action.
That sounds good. So next version, we get a little bit closer here. We're starting to bring the identity more into play. You're starting to see color take its presence within the app. We've pulled that edit icon out, put it onto a floating action button. So it's a little bit more prominent. I wish it still had a little bit more color and felt connected. I can't really tell if that's enabled or disabled or if it wants me to click it or not. And the grid's a little bit closer, but I'm not getting it from the type. I feel like the art direction's a little soft here.
Yeah. Oh, wow. This is This is really looking good now. We've got much better branding, some really featured things. The typography is all integrated. We're using Futura everywhere, and that pencil button really has a little bit of zing. I think now we're looking great.
So that was obviously somewhat accelerated. But this is the kind of engagement that designers are doing all day long. Like whether they're having this discussion with themselves, whether they're talking to a peer, they're doing it casually, they're doing it formally. This process of review, of critiquing is core to the work that designers do. Okay, so we've given you some foundational elements, we've given you some vocabulary. Hopefully you can go out and you can kind of engage in more of these design conversations. And maybe you'll also be aware of the own coded language that your discipline might bring to bear, and just maybe help define a little bit of that for designers. If you're hungry for more,
yeah, please start at design.google.com. We have the material guidelines there, as well as resources, tools, articles, videos, and more. And you can follow us on lots of social media as well.